There is something so galvanizing about the sheer force of location. And when we are here barely 5 minutes walk away from the place at which the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum was issued to the Serbian foreign minister in July of 1914, it galvanizes our thinking. And it galvanizes our thinking about what I believe to be the two great directing forces of modern international relations. One is this overpowering force that we all feel and experience every day. Let's call it economic globalization plus. And the second and countervailing force is the continuing cogency of geography, proximity, nations, and nationalism. And the business of political leadership and diplomatic leadership is to somehow reconcile these two enormous sets of forces, which are both equal realities. Three framing remarks, three propositions about how we in the Asian hemisphere might reflect in the 20th century about the tragedies here. We in Asia might reflect in the 21st century on the tragedies here in the 20th century. And then some concluding remarks about the future of the global order. Framing remark number one, and I really want to build on what my good friend Mohammed said earlier this morning about this not just being a European tragedy, because it is so important in the way in which we frame this in our minds, in our construction of the task for the current century. Here in Serbia, we're here, a quarter of the population were killed. It's a framing remark. If you look at Greater Europe, millions of Russians, French, Austro-Hungarians, British, killed, slaughtered. Look beyond to the key colonial empires and you see the impact of the participation and the subsequent resolutions of the peace conference across the wider world, where we had, as Patrick has just reminded us, the impact of Versailles on China, which itself is a contributing state. And Patrick, I've just got to remind you, my third year university examination question was, please explain the impact of the Versailles Conference on the rise of Chinese nationalism and on the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. So at least in our neighbourhood, we were asked to think about these things. But put yourself in the position of the Chinese at the time. 50 years have been kicked around by the British and a bunch of others. First Opium War, Second Opium War, the War of 1899-1900. The first two of which because the Chinese had the temerity to say they weren't keen on British opium. Then China joins the international order after the collapse of the Qing, becomes the Chinese Republic. They then seek to behave in their perception of what it was to be a responsible global citizen. Barely 6 years into the Chinese Republic, after 2,000 years of empire, and then they are told, sorry, take the back seat when it comes to the return of your sovereign territory after the First World War. The impact on the Chinese consciousness of betrayal by the West is a very rich history then and a very potent force today. And of course, it's not just the impact on China, but the impact on India. Let us not forget that the rise of Indian nationalism occurred after massive Indian contributions to the Great War, when, frankly, the British afterwards said, I'm sorry about that independence deal, we'll just put that off for another half a century as well. And so the rise of Gandhi and the rest. And then, of course, the impact in Africa and the rest of colonial Asia. Then, of course, in the broader global framing of this, there are those of us who, as it were, come from the periphery. Those of us who got roped into this thing. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, from all over the place. And of course the Americans. And when I think of the fact that in a country like Australia at that stage had a population about the same size as Serbia, 4.5 million, 10% of our population wore the uniform, more than 350, 400,000 fought in Europe, 60,000 killed, 160,000 injured, casualty rate of 65%. I mean, this affected every community in our small country at the other end of the world, none of whom knew how to spell Sarajevo, knew where Serbia was, or what the hell it was all about. I find it quite interesting that the two historians of note in the current analysis of the impact of World War I are both Australians and Canadians, deeply connected, but also separated from, if you like, the core combatant states. So thank you, Christopher, and in her absence, Margaret Macmillan. So the point I make about all this is that for the world, as Graham Allison reminds me at the Kennedy School at Harvard University where I now work, there can be no limit to the amount of study we should dedicate to World War I in framing our view of lessons for the future. It affected us all and was the first global war. A couple of other quick framing points, not as long as that one. I said before that the implications of World War I in the Asian hemisphere, the Asia-Pacific, were significant. We've mentioned India, we've mentioned China and China-Japan. Think also of the United States, which we think of as an Asia-Pacific power. And after World War I and the Great Conflagration and the exuberance of Wilsonian idealism and the proposition of the League, the monumental reaction against all global engagement and foreign wars and foreign interventions for the subsequent 20 years of American history. Again, a direct consequence. And final framing remark, just as an Australian. At our best, what is an Australian perspective on these things? I think at our best we are the West in the East, and if at our really best we can sometimes be the East and the West, and being detached but part of all of the above. And perhaps there's something, therefore, in these reflections which makes them a little different. 3 propositions for the future of the Asian Hemisphere coming out of the experiences of World War I. Number 1, no one expected the Great War to happen. The seminal conclusions of Christopher Clark's Great History is that even as of the beginning of 1914, as of May 14, 100 years ago from today, there was no belief that this thing could happen. Your competitor newspaper, the New York Times, in its New Year's Day editorial of 1914, celebrated the new rapprochement which was underway between Germany, France and England. And so was the spirit of the age. So my cautionary tale is this. Globalisation hasn't changed everything. The power and potency of deep nationalism still exist around the world, in particular in our hemisphere. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region, it is a dynamic, productive, highly engaged, integrated 21st century economy sitting across the top of a positively 19th century set of security policy realities, 19th century set of outstanding unresolved territorial disputes, and by and large 19th century sets of nationalisms. And that is our dilemma in our part of the world. And so the cautionary tale for those of us in the Asian hemisphere looking back 100 years, when they thought that this couldn't happen, and the literature of the time that the globalisation of the early 20th century was such that this could never happen. Now, this is my cautionary response to your observations, Patrick, which I fear are too optimistic, is that we too can drift into conflict in Asia. And the sheer mechanics of crisis management, particularly in the events of from the 28th of July to the guns of August, and the weeks leading up to the 28th of July 1914, are cautionary tales in particular about the management of crises when they erupt. Proposition number 2 relates to the whole question of how you manage the difficulty of these sorts of tensions at the same time as you have a global transition of power underway as well. What were the dynamics in Europe in terms of great power transition? You had Britain fearing the rise of Germany, as your cautionary tale at the beginning of this seminar caused us to think and to rethink, to make sure we ticked all the right boxes with the right states. And then, of course, you had German concerns about the rise of Russia, both of which are well documented in the various recent histories which have been produced. And so, against that prism, you had a further fundamental destabilising set of dynamics around which the specificities of what occurred here in the Balkans and elsewhere transformed, or shall I say, transposed themselves. In our part of the world and globally, a parallel debate emerges, of course, in terms of the existing great power and superpower, the United States, and the emerging great power, which is China. I don't believe we can underestimate the significance of this transition, whether it's in perception or unfolding reality. And again, I take a little exception with Patrick on this one, even though we're regional neighbours. And that is that even when China becomes the world's largest economy, which depending on your method of calculation will be either next year, within the next 5 years, or the next 10 years, purchasing power parity, readjustments, market exchange rates, you take your pick. But let's just be cautious and say it's within the next decade. This will be the first time since George III was on the throne of England that the largest economy in the world will be non-Western, non-democratic, and a non-English speaking country. So anyone who thinks this is just kind of an interesting, little change, I suspect that is not the case. Because when you are the primus inter pares globally economically, let me tell you, it begins to shape what rules at least pertain within the global economic order, and then over time, the diplomatic and political order beyond whatever may happen militarily. And so therefore, my second proposition arising from this reflection on the First World War is along these lines, that the core of the equilibrium or disequilibrium in the Asia-Pacific lies in the future trajectory of this critical and crucial bilateral relationship between China and the United States. Xi Jinping calls for a new type of great power relationship, Xinqing Daguo Guanxi. It's a term of art now and a term of debate in everything which is alive within the Chinese academy and public policy circles. At present, it's a headline without any content to populate it. And so the key question is, given all that is going on, can proactive diplomacy construct a way in which this relationship could be managed at a time of fundamental, at least geo-economic transition, and possibly geopolitical and geo-diplomatic as well? And one proposal I've put forward, and I think it needs to be elaborated with others, is that how can these two systems, which are so vastly different, but are now participants in the global economic order, shape new global public goods together? New global public goods. The legitimate complaint about the post-45 settlement is that it was done by a bunch of white guys, essentially, 50 of them, in a room, San Francisco conference, and the other 150 in the current international order have kind of had to just lump it ever since then. I understand how they feel, okay? And in 1945, we Australians, always disrespectful, we saw ourselves as a bit of a champion for the non-great powers and the way in which the economic and social charters of the UN Charter were written. In fact, one of my foreign ministerial predecessors did a lot of the drafting of those sections of the UN Charter to enable the little countries, the small countries, the middle countries to have more of a say, and to ensure that this was not just a geopolitical settlement, but it had an economic dimension and a social dimension, a reflection, if you like, of global Keynesian concerns that we had imbibed in the period since the mid-30s. So my point is this: can we, through the US and China, develop new levels of strategic trust which currently don't exist in their bilateral relationship, by the two of them constructing new global public goods which benefit not just them but the rest of us, but critically help to build trust together? Final proposition for the Asia-Pacific and the way in which it unfolds for the 21st century. Learning from the events of 1914. In 1914, there was no European institution. You sort of idly talked about the concert of Europe and whatever happened out of Metternich and the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon had been removed from the European stage. But essentially, the settlement in 1815 and the settlement in 1919 occurred after two great European conflagrations. And there was no mitigating institution which existed prior to them, frankly. And the great enduring lesson of post-45 Europe is that finally our good friends the French and the Germans decided 3 mass slaughters within 70 years was probably enough for anybody, and we should think about doing it differently. And thank God they did. Many people criticise the European project. As someone who is an historian by instinct, I never do. It is a remarkable institution in putting to bed the ancient demons of history. And so my third proposition for our friends in East Asia, of which we are part in the Asian Hemisphere, is to grow the institutional arrangements of East Asia in a manner that they can begin, through conscious diplomatic decision-making, to reduce pre-existing national tensions. Not eliminate them, but to manage and to reduce. Those which do exist are thin. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference, a Japanese-Australian diplomatic initiative from the late 1980s. The ASEAN Regional Forum, an Australian diplomatic initiative from the 80s, I think, 90s. And then more recently, the East Asian Summit, which we now have the inclusion through good Indonesian diplomacy, together with some of the rest of us, the US and Russia as well. How do we build this to begin to unfold confidence as security building measures? An OSCE type process at least. Methods by which you can manage incidents at sea before they simply escalate into something beyond our control. My concluding point in terms of the overall global order, I think, is along these lines. Beyond the US-China transition question, let's stand back and look at the grand transition which is underway. For 500 years, really, since Da Gama, Diaz and Columbus jumped on boats and, quote, discovered the New World. I thought it existed before they discovered it, but that's a separate question. But in our schools, we're always taught they discovered it, then Cook a couple of hundred years later.
I grew up in Mexico, not mine.
That's right, okay. Well, what's the Spanish view on the discovery of Mexico?
The conquest, you mean the rape of Mexico?
Yeah, conquest, discovery, conquest, and those things which follow it. Is that after 500 years, the centre of geoeconomic gravity has moved to East Asia. And prospectively, when I look at the dynamism of Latin America and I look at the dynamism of many states in Africa, there is a fundamental global shift underway as well. It'll take some time to work through. But what do all the others have in common? By and large, they've all been colonised by the rest of us. And frankly, if you understand, I think as our good friend from Senegal said before, the impact of that on the national psychologies of the countries of Africa and certainly of Asia, where every country, with the exception of the Kingdom of Thailand, was colonised, and Japan, for most of the period from about the 16th century, is that there is a legitimate expectation that there is about to be a different season. But here's the problem. If the rules of the international system are to be changed into what? Remember what Churchill said about democracy, the worst system of government in the world except for all the others? That's kind of my view of the UN. It's the worst system of international government in the world except for all the others. So the question is, how do we actually enhance the rules of this system? And what's the proposition within it I put? The great powers, by and large, are relatively content with the system. Post-45, they became P5, and unless anyone here has got news to the contrary, I don't see the P5 changing much into the future. Anyone got any news recently from New York to suggest that, or the other 5 capitals? I don't think so. Have you ever known a nation state to say, I've got a bunch of power, I'm about to give it to you? Not in my recent memory. But there are a bunch of us in the UN system who are not great powers, who are middle powers, who are small powers, but the great term I like in international relations theory is constructive powers, whose single objective it is, because they are not big enough to obtain their most basic national objectives unilaterally, and that they therefore need a multilateral system to underpin the rules of the system which protect them, that we need a new group of a term which I phrased this morning, listening to Mohammed carefully, a new coalition of the multilaterally willing, the CMW, to make the system work. Be realistic, you can't change it overnight, but frankly, if enough of us do with sufficient critical mass, in terms of our diplomacy, our economics and the rest of it, it could be a voice which cannot be ignored against the single principle that a rules-based system underpinning open politics, open economies, open societies, a rules-based system and protection of sovereignty is not beyond the reach of us all. Political leadership is necessary for that, but I think we can get there. And rather than be simply pessimistic about the prospect that history repeats itself, we're condemned to repeat it, I have a non-determinist view of these things. We can make a difference.